Welcome everybody to the first in a series of Music Matters seminars. This series has been organised by the Musicology and Ethnomusicology Hub to promote discussion on topics of importance and relevance to music research in general, and in particular, of course, for the benefit of our own postgraduate students at the Conservatorium, many of whom are engaged in research which involves practice, whether it's in the form of music performance or composition, those two areas in particular. Also, sonic arts has postgraduate students in practice-led research areas. I think there's a lot of discussion, debate. Some of it is misinformation and disinformation in this particular area, and what we're hoping, with the help of our distinguished collection of panelists today, to sort out some of the issues surrounding this kind of research. So I think it's appropriate for me to introduce our panel for today, which has undergone some last-minute changes, which I will explain to you. So I'll begin by introducing Sally Macarthur, one of the members of the Musicology and Ethnomusicology Hub. And Sally is a versatile and distinguished researcher in the field of musicology. Sally, would you like to tell us about yourself and about your interest in this topic?
Thanks, Stephen. Well, I guess I suppose what I've done a lot of work on is women's music and feminist research, and I've recently moved into using Deleuzean philosophy and new materialist philosophy, where actually Paul and I supervising April, who is also using that philosophy. So it's working with creative concepts and thinking about musicology as a creative discipline, as opposed to the idea that it's not that. I'll elaborate that a little bit more perhaps later. But I think for me, my interest in this topic over many years has been the fact that I've observed that the space in the academy is not a level playing field, that people who are producing creative work don't have a value system imposed on it in the same way that the value system is imposed on traditional research. Now, you can debunk that idea if you wish. This is all about debating the question. But for me, the way I've seen it is that peer review is really rigorous in traditional research, and it can often mean that it'll take as much as 3 years to get a journal article finally into print, whereas I've watched colleagues dash off a piece of music, put it in the researcher portal, and then have it count, in a very short space of time. So that's one of my bugbears in this space. And then the idea that it is research, is it research, is a really big question mark. And I guess that if one is looking at it from the lens or from the perspective of traditional research, to many people, it doesn't resemble anything like traditional research. So is it research? And of course, I think that article that I sent out is practice or artistic practice research, covers 3 of the main positions that people take up. So essentially, that's my interest in this topic. There are other interests, but I won't continue on. Now, that's just a brief statement about it.
Thank you, Sally. You have boldly put your point of view out there, and I'm sure that there will be people who are ready to take you up on some of those points. I think
Yeah.
you've highlighted a couple of interesting aspects of that. One has to do with the idea of creativity and what role it plays in research in any form that it exists. Another interesting question, which again I think people will take up as part of this discussion. Well, if they don't take it up, I will. Now I'd like to introduce Paul Watt. Paul is also part of the Musicology and Ethnomusicology Hub here at the Elder Conservatorium. His research is multifaceted, includes 19th century music, musical biography, criticism, popular music, intellectual history. He's received research fellowships from the Australian Research Council, and he's director of the Street Music Research Unit, which actually sounds a most fascinating thing. Paul, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself and your interest in this topic?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. I'm going to talk very briefly about the work that I do at the Busking Project in Berlin. I'm director of research there, and we offer research training to students who are working on street music in every discipline you could imagine. And we are not tied to a university, and we mentor students from all over the world. And that process of working with students in higher degrees in Europe, South America, in Asia, and other parts of the world, shows a very different landscape in the way that a higher degree in practice is executed in other countries. And something that I feel firmly about is that in Australia, we don't reflect enough or audit so much, or as nearly as regularly we should, is what do our doctoral degrees actually do? Why do we do our doctoral degrees? And in working with these students, they look at an Australian practice PhD with bewilderment, wonder and bewilderment, because it is a completely foreign concept to other parts of the world. The other issue that I will speak to is I've supervised a lot of students in ethnomusicology, musicology, and practice-based projects that at some point in candidature they swap. So the musicologist finds that they're actually better served by a practice-based method, and a practice-based method might find that actually they're more of an ethnographer. And to me, sometimes, but not always, these kinds of discussions are had far too late in the candidature process. And I wonder, and I think regularly about the way that we admit candidates to higher degrees in general in music in Australia. Are we testing our applicants for fitness of purpose in methodology and conceptual framework, or are we immediately pigeonholing them as a musicologist or a practice-based researcher? And I think there needs to be conversation there around entrance requirements and looking at ways other universities around the world assess a candidate for a doctorate in music, regardless of what they're interested in. So they're the sorts of things that I'm interested in.
Good. Thank you, Paul. Next, I'd like to introduce April Mitchell. April is a late addition to our panel because unfortunately Dylan Henderson, who had recently very successfully completed his own research in the field of the music of Chopin and Chopin's pianos, is sick and unable to join us. April is a postgraduate PhD candidate in musicology, and she's researching the music and the performances of Freddie Mercury. Her approach is through a new materialist approach to this topic, so it's cast within a very particular kind of theoretical framework, which I think is very interesting and very new. April, would you like to tell us a little bit about your research and also your interest in the relationship between performance, practice, and traditional musicological research?
So my interest is, as you'd expect, very new. From what I've been doing with the readings the past few days, is thinking about how it would relate to what I'm doing, and what I'm doing is quite interdisciplinary. And if anyone read that, the introductory chapter, I think it was in, by Tara, she does make some very bold statements about how interdisciplinarianism, if that's what she called it, is not rewarded at all. So a lot of my interest in this is about the definitions and the hang-ups on definitions, and also value, which has a lot to do with new materialism, trying to break down those definitions and how, I guess, value systems as well. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Thanks, April. Now I'd like to introduce Jennifer Clark. Jennifer is a professor of history in the School of Humanities here at the University of Adelaide, and she's an historian of American and Australian cultural history. Jennifer, thanks for joining us from Melbourne. Would you like to tell us a little about your interest in this topic?
Thanks a lot, Stephen, and thanks very much for the invitation to join this seminar and be on this panel. I feel I'm the outsider here. I'm a ring-in, because I am an historian with some knowledge and some experience of music, but I'm not a musicologist, nor well qualified enough to come even close to that title. But I am interested in intellectual and cultural history, the expression of ideas and feelings in the arts, and therefore I know music is a valuable historical source. But Matt Karush has written accurately, I think, that historians avoid using music as a source as somehow impenetrable, even ineffable. And there is evidence that this divide is real. Karush reports that when the American Historical Association dedicated its 2015 annual meeting to history and other disciplines, organisers called for work that engaged with anthropology, material culture, archaeology, visual studies, and museum studies. But they were absolutely silent about music and musicology. And those who do recognise the importance of music in the stories they want to tell actually tend to focus on lyrics and don't actually talk about the music at all. So my interest here is really how to bridge that gap in humanities research. How can, in my immediate interest, historians, but perhaps other disciplinary practitioners as well, feel able to use music as a source to say something meaningful about what is an enormously important part of all of our lives. And my current work in this space is trying to find a way to write about the music, not the lyrics, in an historical context, in a meaningful and significant way, so that it adds to historical understanding of the place of music in historical context, and at the same time does not alienate the non-musicologist who might want to read it. And I think we are helped somewhat by Small's term of musicking, which has allowed us to legitimately focus on music as a process rather than a product. And that has opened doors for historians who can look at how music sits within cultural life. And there is a place for interpreting music in ways other than the traditional musicological research that sets music research apart and outside the realm of other readers and other disciplines. And I think if historians were more willing to approach music, then a whole new world would open up for us. The question for me is, what is needed for that to happen? Can musicology as a discipline accept a blurring of its disciplinary edges? Can it welcome in outsiders and ring-ins like me?
Thank you, Jennifer. Some very interesting points, which I've no doubt will be taken up in the discussion this afternoon. Next, I'd like to introduce somebody whom I have not met myself, actually. This is Lloyd. Van Toff. We met a few minutes ago on Zoom. Lloyd has recently, just 2 weeks ago, joined us here on campus as a new lecturer in woodwind, and he comes to us from the Yale School of Music. Lloyd, welcome to this seminar. Welcome to the University of Adelaide as well.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I guess my perspective on this whole matter really comes as a practitioner, a practicing artist and performer first and foremost. And my sort of brief and limited forays into research have come as a result of provocations of topics and questions that I've found in my own sort of creative practice. Specifically, these topics relate to music education and careers in music, and what a career in music looks like from a young person's perspective. Really, I also, apart from being head of woodwind here at the Conservatorium, I'm also employed still at Yale University in their Oral History of American Music project, and that's a really quite remarkable initiative that's dedicated to solely creating primary source material by the form of sort of interviews with prominent American musical figures. Why I think that is important, and how that relates to my, I guess, my viewpoint on this topic is that for me, increasingly more and more in terms of my practice and having it become informed by any sorts of research, I'm finding myself, well, yes, more and more leaning towards reading types of researches, the type of research that is considered performance based and performance led, the type of research where there's a creative output and exegesis. And the reason behind this is because often I find myself being able to put myself into that researcher's shoes more and more so than from a musicological perspective. And so I suppose I'm here as a practitioner, and I'm here to, I guess, go into bat for practice-led and practice-based research. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Lloyd. Okay, just before we begin the conversation, just the way in which we're organizing this to stop this getting out of control. If you have a question, yeah.
Stephen, can I just interrupt and say Grayson is here?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, Grayson. Sorry, Grayson. Oh gosh. You went on the kind of top line. I overlooked you on the screen there. Grayson, welcome.
How are you?
You are also a valuable member of our distinguished panel of experts. Grayson has been at the University of Adelaide for quite a long time as part of the Centre for Aboriginal Studies in Music. I see you have your Chasm hat on. Good, thank you.
Always repping, Stephen.
Yep. Grayson is also a higher degree by research candidate currently in the MPhil program, but he has a life as a practicing musician and composer. Grayson, could you tell us a little about yourself and your interest in this topic?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and thanks for having me on. Hopefully I'll be able to contribute to the conversation along the way. But my interest involves my practice-led research in Indigenous music, composition, and performance. And so over the years, I've spent a lot of my time investigating and researching ways to improve Indigenous health through music, Indigenous language revival through music, and also work in areas around Indigenous incarceration, which is overrepresented in across Australia. So in a nutshell, that's my interest.
Great, thank you, Grayson. Okay, so in general, this is how we run this meeting, because we have a lot of people here. You're spread across two screens and I can't see everybody at once. So if you have a question or if you wish to make a comment, the best way for me to keep track of that is through the meeting chat, which you all have access to. I'm sending everyone at the meeting a chat message right now, so you know where to find me. And if I'll be watching that. If you have a question or a comment, or you wish to make a contribution to the discussion, you're most welcome to do that. But if you want to make a contribution in the form of speaking to a matter, then please just let me know first by chat that you want to do that, and then I can manage the meeting, I think, a bit better. So that's the way we're running it today. We'll see how it works. So I've just sent a message on chat to everyone just to say, reply. You can reply individually to me. You'll find my name, Stephen Whittington, on the list of people who are present. And that's the way we'll manage it. We'll see how it works. Okay, so at the present moment, I don't have any questions yet, but to initiate the discussion, I'd like to ask members of the panel a question myself, just to get things started. Currently, in the way in which research is viewed within the university system and viewed by, for example, by the Australian Research Council and so on, we have something which is called traditional research and something which is classified as non-traditional research. I'm a little bit bothered by the term non-traditional research. First of all, because it attempts to define something by a negative, and it doesn't say what it is, it says what it isn't. Also, it places a lot of emphasis on the nature of the output rather than the content. So I'd like a couple of panel members to comment on the idea of non-traditional research. And I'll direct this first of all to Paul. Paul, would you like to express a view on this topic?
I agree with you, Stephen. I don't think the nomenclature helps. And I think in the future, it would be good if we didn't actually have to use the word non-traditional and traditional. And certainly during my time at Monash University, we actually were successful in getting those two terms out of the description for the doctorate in the School of Music. Of course, the application process was different, but they are unhelpful terms. And they do, I think, create a false dichotomy and a silo mentality in schools where we pigeonhole people a little too early, perhaps in doctoral programs, about where they fit, where for most candidates it might take a year or so to find their feet. I also think that I'm not sure that if I'm have understood you correctly, but I think sometimes non-traditional, as you say, Stephen, puts an emphasis on the result rather than the process.
Yeah.
And that process is sometimes, unfortunately, linked to method. But methodology and process, I hope we know, are two very completely different things. So sometimes the methodology or the journey is not so important as the outcome at the end. The ARC terminology and even the ARC's definition of research is based on the UNESCO model that is fairly limiting. But that's what we have to work with. There's no way around this. I know we're not talking about the ARC so much, but the rearrangement of the FOR codes are arguably a step in the right direction, but that's not to do with high degree research. But I think they're unhelpful research, and I think it's sometimes unfortunate that a student has to think, oh, is it non-traditional research, and is it composition, or is it ethnography, or what if I'm composing in the field? And what am I, it doesn't help music research, I don't think, to have these two binaries, I guess. So I think, moving towards a future look at a doctorate in music, whatever field, it would be good to have a better vocabulary, and it would be good if some of the leadership groups in the Academy in Music Research would actually engage with that. It's not to say that they're not, but it would be good for organisations outside the university sector to have a role to play in this, just as journalism studies have come up with a definition of what research is for journalism. And it's good that this isn't run by the universities, it's run by a professional society of journalists to guide the Academy in what that can look like. And it's inclusive and it's diverse. I don't necessarily like it, but I think they do a better job than what we have achieved in musicology. So I think, in a nutshell, it would be good to loosen up this language and to move away from these two dichotomous kinds of ideas.
Somebody has asked the question, what terminology is used for research outputs by creative writing? I can't answer that question. Jennifer, perhaps
I can.
Oh, okay.
In the sense that I've done a lot of the assessment of all the nitros, as they call them, at Western Sydney University, and creative writing fits into the nitro basket. That is the non-traditional research basket.
Right. I have a question from Jenny Shaw, and it concerns the discipline divides between music and other humanities generally. Jennifer, would you like to comment further? I think you raised this in your introduction. Would you like to comment further about the divide that seems to separate music off from other humanities in the research area?
Yes, Stephen, I can't see Jenny's question there.
She sent it directly to me.
Ah, so. Right. Yes, I think traditional musicology seems to be a world unto itself, and I think that's because it's heavily based in technical and discipline-specific language. So when you read a traditional piece of musicology, it's impenetrable to anyone who doesn't actually know that high-level musical terminology. And so therefore the research that you're reading can actually be meaningless to an historian who may wish to use that. So I think historians that want to use music are put off by that. And so you find a lot of historical work on music topics really just uses lyrics, which is not using music, it's actually using creative writing, I suppose. If you want to call lyrics the equivalent of poetry, for example, you're using words. So historians are not afraid to use a variety of sources. They will delve into art or film or sculpture or any of those sorts of things. But because I think music uses its own language and is very jargonistic in that respect, that a lot of the research, it just can't be used. And so it means that what historians do is not use it at all. So they work in a completely separate area. And I think this is a great shame because, well, let me give an example. I'm writing some material at the moment where I want to make some commentary on work by Howells. So I look up the research that has been written by Howells, and that which I've found from musicologists I can't use because it's so specific and so technical, it actually doesn't serve my purpose. And so I think there is this great divide. And yet if I'm to write about Howells, I would be howled down by musicologists because I'm not writing traditional musicology. And I think there is this tremendous divide. And I guess I would like to see people from the humanities be more freely able to use music and to comment on it and to have comfortable commentary and intelligent commentary, maybe coming from their own discipline, that sort of bridges that divide between musicology and other disciplines. And I guess my question is, what would that look like? What does that language entail? and how would we do that? And this is why I think some of the stuff that uses the Deleuzian methods and uses new materialism is actually a way to do that, because you can approach music from a completely different direction, and therefore you're not contradicting the musicologists, or you're not batting up against traditional musicology. You're coming in from a new perspective that opens music up to non-specific disciplinarians. And I'd be interested to hear, Sally, what you think about that.
Yes, I was.
Yes, Jennifer. Oh, sorry, Stephen.
So I was just about to direct that question also to Sally, to see whether you find a way to bridge this divide. I know I have a comment I see on the chat from somebody about creating an unnecessary binary opposition between music in a practice-led form. That was Charles, I think, was it? Yes. And musicology. Do you think there is well, it seems everybody feels there is some kind of separation at some point. Can we do that?
So can I just go directly to Jennifer's point, because I think it's a really interesting point. I've just completed an article with a non-trained person in music, no qualifications in music, and we wrote about the RAC2, the Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 2, and she wanted to represent the opening bars of that work, da 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 da, and she literally wrote da da. She wrote it that way. But what saved it, in my view, from it being child play almost, was the new materialist thinking and the concepts that she used in order to talk about the affect and the ways in which this work can be read differently from its usual reading, which is that it's usually given a structural reading and we trot through all the keys. We remark on the fact that it's gone into E major in the second movement and so on and so forth. And of course, that's just, to her mind, that's behind the scenes. What's really important is what it's doing. And so with that emphasis, we can cross the divide between what a musician does with a music like that and what a non-trained musician might do with it, and still have something meaningful to say about it. Sorry, Stephen.
Yes, it seems to me at least that music has an abstract element to it, if we'll call it that, which is sound. But it's extremely difficult to write well about the sound of music and to put it into a context. If you take Rach 3, what is the meaning of an F minor triad at the beginning of that piece? It's difficult. There are people who have, I think, a very special talent for being able to describe the sound that is heard and make it meaningful to others, but it's not an easy thing to do. I have a follow-up question for Jennifer from Anna Henwood. She makes the following comment and question. While it's true there's a great divide because traditional musicology requires the language of music, is not all research language specific in some way or other? I'm thinking of linguistics, physics, mathematics, medical science, and so
on. Yes, I think that's really interesting, because when I was thinking about the impenetrable nature of some of the traditional musicology papers, I thought of the parallel of trying to read maths and physics papers, where, and I don't know if other people have had this same experience, when trying to read maths and physics papers, I tend to read the written word, and then when it gets to the mathematical equations, I skip over that part. But that is mathematical language, and it's a language as if it was in a foreign language. It's like reading a piece of history where the quotations are in foreign language and not translated. And if you don't know the language, you skip over it. And so reading maths and physics papers, which I've also done, I read the bits that I can understand, which is the explanations in the English language, and skip over the maths. So I think it applies exactly the same to the traditional musicological papers. When it starts to talk about the music language that you've just mentioned, you know, what key is it in, or whether there's a triad or what. If you don't understand that, then you skip over that part. But my issue with traditional musicology is that the bits you can skip over actually fill the paper, and there's very little descriptive writing that sits around those parts. And so there's a lot that you just can't get anything out of the musicology. And this is where I think Sally's point is really interesting, because if you can come at the description of music using a different perspective, in this case, a different theory and a different theoretical approach, sure, there's a language to that as well. And some of the new materialism and Deleuzian language has its own jargon, and you've got to get to understand what those terms mean. And so there is that introductory development that you need as well. But it does provide another entry point into the language, and into the music language. And I think that's actually really valuable, because it means that you can talk about language, talk about music using a different language, and one that perhaps is more easily understood by more people. And this makes the music more accessible. And I don't think it lowers the value of the work at all. It just makes it more accessible and allows you to ask new questions, and allow you to explore new connections. And one of the great values of new materialism and Deleuzian philosophy is it does allow you to open up these different perspectives, so that you can say, well, actually, I never thought of it like that, but now I can see that. I can ask this question and that question and explore out. And so I think it actually strengthens research, and it strengthens the way in which you can use music in a research context. So I think it can only advantage musicology, broadly read, and not necessarily within that traditional confinement of what we would understand as traditional musicology.
I think it's time to turn this particular point over to April, who has spent a considerable amount of time trying to come to grips with new materialism. April, do you think what Jennifer has described as the jargon of different theoretical frameworks is difficult for people to understand? Does it present a barrier to understanding similar to that which the technical vocabulary of music does?
In my opinion, I think the way new materialism, at least what I'm doing in my project anyway, it's a bit more accessible. For instance, I've tested it on my family members who have no idea about anything musical because they are tone deaf. And I've basically given them a little bit of what I've written, and I've said, what do you think? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? And although they don't necessarily understand all of it, because there are terms in there from new materialism that they're not going to understand, they understand more of it than when I try and explain it in musical analysis terms. And then they start, like Jennifer was talking about, asking different questions, ones that maybe I wouldn't have even thought about. And I think if we're going on all this this divide stuff between, you know, musicology and practice-led stuff, I think, for me at least, it boils down to what is creativity and why the end result, as you were saying, Stephen, before, the end result versus the content. And for me, coming from a new materialist perspective, I think we treat creativity as a noun instead of a verb. We talk about the product and all of that, whereas I think if we think more about the mindset and maybe the process, maybe we can bridge that gap a little bit more. But yeah, that's just my thoughts.
Sure. I'm reminded of a famous case in the history of writing about music, and that is a book called Formalized Music, which was written by the composer Yanis Xenakis. It came out in the 60s, and many people bought it. I've never met anybody who has read any part of it other than the 2 chapters, which are more or less about Greek philosophy and aesthetics, and the other 90% of the book, which is dense mathematics, I don't think anybody ever read. In spite of that, it proved to be a very influential book, but then only by virtue of the fact that there were a couple of chapters which were readable. You raised the question of creativity, and I think it's time to ask a question about is research a creative activity? And if so, what is the nature of creativity in research? Grayson, would you like to talk first of all to this point?
Yeah, so what is creativity in research? I mean, obviously, in my field, it's about practice-led research. It's about working in particular communities. In my field, about how to revision, repurpose, reinvent different ways of knowledges inside music, and coming off stories and the research around stories in different contexts and knowledges in particular communities. The only way that I've found is relevant and practical is getting inside the music and creating new ways that reflect and resonate those sounds and knowledges. There is one reflection I want to make with this one, which is when I was talking to one of my Chasm students a few years ago. He's from the Anangu Pitjantjatjara community, and his name's Zachariah Fielding, and he's fairly well known in Indigenous music circles in the industry. He's had a song on Eurovision as a contestant. There was one song that he brought to life about Jidi Jota. And Jidi Jota is about the ceremony of song with children in the APY lands. And he played me this song when it first came out, and first thing I heard was that melody is incredible. It's absolutely haunting. And I said to Zachariah, how did you come up with that melody? And he said, when he grew up on the lands, in the APY lands, and they had ceremony, they would paint themselves up with ochre, and there would be fires and smoke. And he said, the melody came from the smoke smell of the ochre. And that is only something that you can do while living in amongst and living in that ceremony and that style. And so I tried to put this down in words to work out and try to give it some sort of context of, well, this melody is based off this mode or whatever, but he was clearly not thinking about that. So I guess that's a clear example of working in the field in practice-led research in my field.
Thanks, Grayson. Lloyd, over to you just to follow up on that. Clearly, I mean, there's been a lot of research done in the field of performance practice, and of course, notably in the area of Baroque and early music performance practice, but also I think increasingly research in performance practice in the 19th and even early 20th centuries, because it's a continuously evolving field. I wonder how the importance of that kind of research is to somebody like you, primarily a performer and teacher.
Well, you talked about creativity, and for me, creativity in research is any sort of unique or innovative response to a particular problem. And the answer to that is really interesting for me as a teacher and a performer to understand. When we're talking about practice-led or practice-based researchers, the most effective, the most interesting sort of outputs that I find in this medium are the ones that are able to sort of harness the quality and the power of the artwork or the artist involved. As a clarinetist, for example, to your point about, you know, performance and period performance, and how vital that has become to practice and teaching right now, I often wish that I could be there and, you know, have a talk to Brahms, or perhaps more importantly his muse Richard Mühlfeld, to whom was the clarinetist who inspired Brahms, just to understand what he thought about the music and the clarinet. And thinking back now, if he had written some sort of thesis or exegesis based on his own sort of performance of these works, of these sonatas, that would be a tremendously useful tool and asset for us to have. And so this is where I really see the value in practice-based or practice-led research, because as I suggested earlier, this is really the type of paper and type of literature that I find myself consuming more and more as a teacher and as a performer. And there's a point here, I think, in the chat by Fiona, that Fiona makes here, that relates to audience. And I think this is a really interesting thing to consider. I mean, me, who is an audient, I guess, someone who consumes this research, I'm far more concerned in you know, what an honors or a master's student has to say about performing a particular work, and the troubles that they find, and the solutions, the creative solutions that they've found, and taking that information and implementing that into my own practice is something that is, yes, so beneficial for me. Yeah.
Thanks, Lloyd. I on the question of creativity and research in composition, I see we have a question from Charles, and it's a question which is an old one that's been around for a long time. Essentially, what he's asked is this: would we deny a PhD to Beethoven and yet award it to scholars writing about his music? It is an interesting point. I have one reflection on the relationship between composition and research. I have a friend who is a distinguished theoretical physicist, and I asked him once, what do you do every day? He says, I sit down at my desk and stare at a blank piece of paper. And from a point of view of a composer, I understand exactly what he means, because I sit down at the desk looking at a blank piece of manuscript paper, and I think there is a parallel between these two situations. So theoretical physics and composition I see as being very closely connected to one another. But since Charles has asked the question,
can I just hop in here, Stephen? Sure. I just wondered whether we could have the people who are asking questions to actually ask them, because I think putting a context around the question might be a good idea. You know, for example, you know, why are you asking that question, Charles? You know, what, you know, it'd be interesting to know the context, you know, why, and that goes for everyone who's asking a question. What is it that about your own work and your own kind of research that asks that question? And so I just wondered whether we could have the participants, you know, also chipping in. Would that be okay? Sorry.
Yes, I'm just trying to manage the meeting as efficiently as possible, but it certainly, members of the panel, if you'd like to invite the questioner to comment, then please do. Well, Charles, I think it's been thrown over to you. Would you like to elaborate on the question that you posed?
Yes, I would. I'll keep it very short. I would contend that all research, all good research in any discipline across the university, any university, is about identifying and then investigating a particular problem. I also contend that one can, and we do, investigate such problems through composition, through the stuff of music, the stuff of composition, and through the stuff of performance. So I think music, what we're terming practice-led aspects of music, I prefer just to call it music, frankly. The primary stuff of music, in other words, the compositions and the performances, I contend that that is research-worthy, fully research-worthy, and always has been, doesn't need to apologize for itself in any way whatsoever, and is a valid medium, a bona fide medium for solving problems. And I think if we take test cases, for example, if we take the test case of Beethoven writing the Diabelli Variations, how do you take a stupid, annoying, inane little tune, such as he was provided with by Mr. Diabelli, and how do you turn it into one of the greatest artworks ever? That is a problem-solving activity conducted entirely through musical composition itself. And, interestingly, it is also texted. It is a text. I can understand some misgivings from people within our music community towards things that maybe don't appear to have a text, but musical composition is a text. It's just a text recorded in musical notes, but it is a text, just as valid as any text that is created from letters and words. And so I would suggest that that debate that I put up there about would we deny a PhD to Beethoven, would he be turned down? I think not, certainly not since the early 1990s. I think that argument was debated in full. I think that argument was put to bed and we moved well beyond it.
Thank you, Charles. I'd like to just ask Paul to comment on that. And it seemed to me that the relationship between the practice and the research is a key issue here. And there are different ways in which research and practice can relate to one another. Is it possible to say what that relationship should be?
I don't think I have anything new to say on that. I mean, there are libraries full of books on this from the 1990s that I believe I do agree in large part with what Charles has said. I think that debate has been had. I think the debate I'd like to see is getting beyond the artifact and the exegesis and the binary of a practice-based research and argue that all research is practice-based, whether in computing, anatomy, musicology, performance. We are all our students are ethnographers in training, or composers in training, or historians in training. And surely our doctoral journey is all about becoming better practitioners at whatever we're going to do when we get to the end. And that's why I'd like to see if I actually am working with another institution at the moment to reinvent the music PhD. And candidates won't be admitted by discipline. They'll be admitted by methodology and conceptual framework. That will have the biggest bearing on admission criteria rather than the product at the end. That might be a bit extreme and we're still working through that, but it gets away from the binaries of the exegesis and the artifact. And this is something Tara Brabazon talks a lot about. But it's not to say that the traditional 80,000 word musicology thesis should stand as it does for the rest of eternity. I mean, that is also up for grabs, and there are European universities that are starting to think differently about the thesis only approach. I don't have any answers. These are just sort of debates that I've been having and conversations I've been having at the moment. But I will say that creativity is part of every doctoral candidate's journey, regardless of discipline in the university. You know, writing a score, writing prose, performing from a score or improvising, it's all creativity. I mean, the people in creative writing will tell you that writing an 80,000 word novella is creative. And just as writing a formal thesis in the humanities is a creative process as well. It's a discipline and a technique of writing. So, you know, whether you write a score or you interpret a score or a set of words, the creative process is not confined to the artist. So I want to give an example here. The Dean of Arts 2 deans ago would come to the School of Music at Monash, and invariably she would say she loved coming to the School of Music at Monash because she was surrounded by talented and gifted people. And the head of school at that time was a composer and asked her to stop saying that. he said everybody in the university is creative and gifted. And we in the music school, of course, we know we're gifted, but we're no more gifted than the people in the biochemistry department or people in human geography. We're all, what binds us as a community of scholars is creativity and our search for answers to our problems. Our musicians are just as creative as, you know, talk to someone in translation studies and wrestling with a really complex Russian translation of French literature, which I've sat on a board to assess the creativity and research output and that's massively creative to wrestle with that kind of fantastic stuff, as it would be someone wrestling with a Schenker analysis or questioning a Schenker analysis or writing a piece of music that's so out of the box. So it's all creative. And I think sometimes I personally get a little fed up with the exceptionalism of music. And perhaps this might talk to some of Professor Clark's stuff as well, that universities are communities of creativity. It's not just confined to any one discipline. I've had a bit of a rant there, I think, but I quite like this approach that we shouldn't exceptionalize ourselves all the time, I think. And that's important for transdisciplinary work, cross-disciplinary work as well.
I think speaking to that question of creativity, I was actually in dialogue on email with Elizabeth Wood, who you may know as a scholar a pioneer scholar really in gay and lesbian musicology. And one of the things that's quite distinctive about her work are the kinds of concepts that she brought to bear on the analysis of the music that she was talking about, borrowed from all sorts of places. But she wrote me a little email about what she thinks creativity is, and I just wondered whether that would be an interesting thing to throw into the mix here. Would you mind if I did that?
If it's not too long?
No, it's not very long. She says that creative writing, composing, performing has little relation to the meanings, understanding and applications of traditional research and or creative research. In her journalist career and academic career, and also her descriptive, critical, interpretive and fictional writings, she sees each of these as distinct and not the same, but can be hybridized or doubled. For example, interpretive criticism or experimental fiction or performative critical writing that aims to embody the theory on which it is founded. I've always sought to be creative, that is, original, innovative, experimental. But each of these contexts have their own rules, habits, modes, that is, ways of knowing, presenting, exchanging, mediation, ideas and information that are derived from observation and other ways of data or factual informed knowledge. Each can be tested. So in sum, she thinks the creative production of whatever kind is not the same as, but can make use of, research. But research may be creative. The first creative is adjectival. The second, research, is both noun and verb.
Thank you. Jennifer, I'd like to ask you whether the humanities have gone through similar kinds of debates, maybe asking questions like, would we give a PhD to Dickens or Tolstoy or not, when we give PhDs to people who write about them? Has that kind of debate also been had in the humanities outside of music?
I think there's a number of disciplines that have had creative output as their PhD product, and creative writing is an obvious one, where people write short stories or short novels or whatever the case may be, plays. So there is, I think, always been, well, I shouldn't say always been, but there has been an acceptance of creative output as PhD worthy. What often happens is that there's also an expectation of an exegesis that goes with that. So you have your creative product, and then you have your discussion and explanation and context provided for that creative product. But I think in that sense, music is no different from creative writing or drama or dance or any of those sort of areas where PhDs are awarded. And I do agree with the comment about the creativity that sits across all of the disciplines. And, you know, some of the best discussions I've had about creativity have come with engineers, and they carry an unfortunate stigma that they don't have a lot of creativity. You know, the old joke that engineers plant trees in rows. But engineering requires a lot of creativity to address problems. And I think the comments that have been made about the way in which creativity and problem solving are linked together can be applied to any discipline that we see within the university. Similarly, you know, we've talked about physics and mathematics, very, very creative to come up with solutions and problem solving exercises. So I think you know, this issue of creativity is in many ways quite moot, because you do require creativity and imagination in pretty much all of the disciplines. And I think I would take issue with someone to come up with a discipline within a university context that does not require creativity to actually reach a PhD standard. I mean, we need to be creative and imaginative to do that. I mean, I know people have had discussion around this in terms of history, about the imaginative element in history, with the idea that history is about facts, and where's the imagination in history? But you do have to have an imaginative approach to come up with really good history. So I think creativity, imagination belongs to all disciplines, belongs to the university. It's a universal desire to have creativity within all our disciplines. And so, you know, some of the things that people in music have been struggling with, I think, you know, could be applied equally to any discipline in the university. And to that extent, I absolutely agree. I think, Paul, you talked about a number of those things.
Thanks, Jennifer. I suppose one question that arises in my mind about the old story question itself, would Beethoven or Tolstoy get a PhD, is I doubt that they would actually want one, to be honest. They would have no need for one. But in any case, Fiona Macarthur, where are you online?
Yes, I am here.
You have a question you would like to...
I do. Well, it's a comment and a question, just building on everything that's been said. Just around when we're talking about creative practice and the way that we set up our research degrees, in that you either complete your 80,000 word thesis or you complete a creative work in exegesis. And I just wonder whether we need to be that strict about those rules. I mean, I made a comment in the chat about surely there's no difference between practice to solve. I mean, obviously creative work needs to solve a problem or a challenge, but there's no difference with using practice to do that than a science or engineering or health person uses experiments in a lab to solve those problems. And so do we have to be so strict around having to write an exegesis? Can creative practice form part of our 80,000 word like your thesis? Does it have to be so strict in that divide?
Okay, thanks. That's a question really about the expected format and structure of research outputs in the context of a PhD or master's degree. Would somebody like to comment on that? Actually, Paul. Okay, we'll start with you.
That is a brilliant question, and it's a brilliant question because I think the default is 20,000 or 30,000 words exegesis and artifact. Why can't that be disrupted? I mean, it's an administrative ease that, you know, it's just easy administratively, but why can't a candidate write 50,000 words and instead of having an hour and a half of music, they have an hour of music or 2 hours of music? You know, the other institution I'm working towards are trying to find ways to mix that up, and it's not always the reason, but it's part of the reason why students might jump from musicology to practice-based research, or the other way around, because they need more words or they don't need as many words. And it shouldn't all just be around words, but it is. But there could be in a PhD of the future a much more a sliding scale of words versus artifact. And some European universities do this. Perhaps that's for the future. But I do think it's a really good question why most universities in Australia have settled for this proportion. It's probably a matter of bureaucratic ease, or I'm not sure why, but it's time it could be disrupted, I think, and rethought.
I'd like to ask Grayson, as a current higher degree student, to comment on that. Do you feel that the expectations that have been given to you in your masters, and possibly if you upgrade to PhD, do you feel that they suit or fit you best, or do you find them unnecessarily prescriptive?
That's a good question. I think it's horses for courses, really, because it depends on how far along do you want to evolve your research, how much energy do you have, and how much information needs to be transported or transferred and disseminated. And I had a question on this topic when it first came up from Fiona, which was, I don't know, is there a general overview across Australia regarding the formatting for said research, or is it just all internalized from university to university and discipline to discipline?
Yes, that's a good question.
As far as I'm aware, it's all pretty standardized in terms of the split between the exegesis and the creative work. I think that's right. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Getting back to me, I think it is. It's hard to say at this stage of the game. I'm part-time, so it's about the information that needs to be said and disseminated in my own research. Getting down to the writing component of this, I think I've already have my chapters laid out. So in my perspective, I think it's fair.
I think one of the big issues that I think Tara Brabazon also raises, and that is that the way that often the exegesis seems quite divorced and separate from the creative work. So, it's almost like we've got two things. And what she really says is they should be integral. They should be speaking to each other in ways that, the words that you've written about it actually make sense and help illuminate what it is that you've created. And I think that this is one of the bigger problems in this space that I've observed anyway.
In the chat, I noticed that Oliver has made a point that we do have variations that are possible within the submission formats in our school. And Charles, you had a comment you wish to make on this?
Yes, just briefly. I thought Paul and Sally have just made both very good different points. Just Paul first. I agree entirely with you, Paul, about that disruption you referred to. Yes, of course. But we have done that, as Oliver's just pointed out in the chat. So we've already processed over a number of years now quite a range of different formats. So we don't necessarily have to have only 20,000 words dissertation or exegesis. We could have 50,000, and we can adjust those proportions. And so I agree entirely with the point you're making there. And Sally, I agree entirely with your point about the fact that the exegesis shouldn't be separate from the creative thing. Of course, it mustn't. The two things must be integral. So the purpose of the exegesis is to explain, as you said, is to illuminate what the investigative process is through the creative work. In other words, the creative work itself has to embody the research.
Yes.
You can't just submit for a PhD a creative work that isn't research and then add an exegesis which appears to articulate research ideas. If there's a mismatch between those things, it shouldn't get through. Examiners shouldn't let it through.
Thank you, Charles. I'd like to direct a question to Lloyd and just ask you about how you encourage a kind of research-oriented approach to repertoire and performance and creative aspects of performance in your students, because it often seems to me that this should begin when they're undergraduates. The idea of that research and performance are connected shouldn't be something that suddenly appears when you're at honours or postgraduate level, as it often does. Have you given some thought to that yourself, or how would you approach it?
Yeah, often I get very, very many talented students who are curious and inquisitive and who are just wanting to know more. And so they're going out there, they're going onto Google, looking up all sorts of research on the repertoire that they're working on, and I guess the techniques involved specific to the clarinet or chamber music or musicians' careers. Certainly, there's been a sort of a divide, I guess, between research and practice, and that's something that I still don't understand, and I'm not sure we've come to any great conclusions throughout the course of this conversation. But yeah, again, the most effective research for me is the research where I guess the exegesis, if you're talking about practice-led and based research, really illuminates the role of the artwork and makes it, or the artist, and makes it sort of some more visible and I guess accessible for more people. This idea of growth of social capital, or creative capital rather, is really important. And yeah, so it's something that's really encouraged in my own practice. Yeah.
Sometimes it seems to me, reading the exegesis for a performance-led project, the content of it often seems to be mainly of interest to the person who's written it, rather than to somebody else who might be reading it. So I just wonder how we can improve, if you like, the quality of the exegesis writing, so that it's not particular just to the individual, but it may be of actually more general kind of interest and value to others as well. I'm not sure how we go about doing that, but I think, to me, there's something that you have to begin with thinking about, as somebody mentioned earlier, the audience. Who are you writing for when you write an exegesis? Are you writing for yourself? Are you writing for the examiners? Are you writing something that for the benefit of anybody who might be interested in this area in general? Jennifer, how is that kind of thing approached, say, in creative writing?
I think, Stephen, one of the things we should consider here is the fact that disciplines change over time, university requirements change over time, and there are a lot of influences and pressures that have encouraged our disciplines to be more flexible and more open. And if I can say, from the point of view of history, for example, as soon as women became more involved in women's history, there was a greater push to change the way in which what they were writing was more acceptable and was very influential in pushing the boundaries of the discipline. And I'd be interested to hear Grayson's comments on this as well, because the other thing I would say is that when Indigenous students came into writing history, and I'm assuming the same is the case for other discipline areas, they demanded opportunities to express themselves in different ways and to push the boundaries of the discipline. And I'm struck by an Indigenous student in the Department of History recently who wrote a wonderful PhD that sat across what we would call traditional history and personal experience. And in my day, as an historian or a history student, you were never supposed to put your own experience in anything. That was a no-no. You had to have this myth of objectivity. And yet, because the Indigenous experience was so important to sit against the history, the two voices talking to each other, it was essential that personal experience come into it. And therefore, that was unique and that was different. And the Indigenous experience had to be represented in that way. And so I think disciplines have to be open and adaptable to new demands and to the demands of students as they come through and want to express different voices. And I'd be very interested to hear Grayson's take on this from the Indigenous perspective. But I would just end my comments by saying one thing. I do remember examining a thesis once, and the question that came into my mind was, do I fail this thesis or do I give it an HD? And it was because it was so different. It was so out of the box. It was so unique. Did it not match what we expected a thesis to do? Or was it so brilliant that it pushed the boundaries and it opened up new ways of thinking, new questions to ask, new approaches, and that in fact what I was looking at was actually a brilliant piece of work that was going to push the boundaries of the discipline. And I did decide to give that thesis an HD. And I think a lot of Indigenous students have done that to our disciplines. And that's why I'd be very keen to hear Grayson's take on that.
Over to you, Grayson.
Well, thank you. I think it's an incredible moment in tertiary education where we have Indigenous researchers talking and discussing and researching about that part of history that has been lost. And so I really encourage all my students and empower all my students in my field to take on the Indigenous lens, the lived experience, because that part of Indigenous Australia isn't in the book. So it's always coming from a context of historical background, different variations in, locations in Australia that have their own histories and lived experience. And so, of course, when you bring that to the realm of research, they aren't in a lot of history books. And in the field of music, it's another realm again where the voice or the story becomes a new perspective based on lived experience and not so much the traditional contexts. And I just think it's working through my research at the moment, it is drawing on reflection on my own lived experience.
Thanks, Grayson. I'm looking at the time and I see we're approaching 5:30, where initially we said we would finish.
Well, we've got 2 hours, Stephen.
We do potentially have it if there are enough, if there are more questions. Sure. So I was just about to say, if you have questions, get them in quickly. We can go until 6.
I think there are some really interesting questions around value that we haven't explored. How we actually measure value research objects, whether they're creative research objects or whether they are traditional, as we are now, we've got that divide between them. The value system seems to work very well for the peer-reviewed research, but the value system does not work at all, as far as I can see, for creative work that's put into the researcher portal. And in fact, you can just put your work in there and it will count. And so in a neoliberal environment, because that's what we're really talking about, is a neoliberal university that needs to account for itself in terms of its quantity of work. It needs to be able to demonstrate, I suppose, that it has creative outputs, but there's no one really there to scrutinise the value of this work. At least that's the experience I've had in the university I've been in. So I'd be interested in people's view about whether it's possible to create a value system or a way of assessing the value of creative work that's put up as research, so that there is a more level playing field in the research space. Is it ever possible, or is every discipline unique in the way they undertake research and that you can't really standardise it? Is it the neoliberal university that is trying to force us to have standardised ways of assessing things? And is that really like putting square pegs in round holes?
Okay, that sounded like a question to me.
Yes, it is. I'm sorry, I know I'm a panelist, but
No,
I'm
that's all right.
really interested in other people's view of this.
I think you have raised one of the most difficult issues to resolve in this area, actually. So it's an opportunity for each of our panelists, I think, to respond to that, and also for the audience as well. April, do you have a view on quality measurement? How is that achieved with a creative work?
Oh, look, I don't think there's any easy answer, if I'm going to be honest. I don't know whether what's happening right now is working, but because I come from, I guess, I'm not a performer. I do think creatively in my thesis, but I'm not a performer or a composer. So I don't know whether I'm really qualified to answer the question, I guess.
Okay, sure, thank you. Lloyd, could I ask you about this? How do you assess quality in a creative research output, be it a performance or a composition, for example?
I mean, by what value it has to me in my practice, and in what value it extends to me, how it enables me and empowers me to solve my own problems or think about things in different ways. That could go, I mean, that could manifest itself in hearing a recording of standard repertoire played in a new way. I can think of, for example, going back on the Brahms clarinet sonatas, hearing this for the first time played on period instruments as a recording, as a form of research. This was something incredibly informative and useful and valuable for me, whilst there's no exegesis associated with that. Enough was heard and enough was experienced to enable me to form a different viewpoint and a different opinion on my own practice. I suppose what I don't understand coming into this conversation are, what are the governing principles that currently stand behind, how quality of any of these things are currently assessed? Why do we do what we do currently? And is that the way forward in terms of dissolving these issues and finding new forms of creative sort of research?
Yes. Okay. Thanks. I thought the story that Jennifer told about the paper she couldn't decide whether to fail or give a high distinction to. It's quite an interesting one. It does raise the question, of the originality of research and whether we are actually able to recognize it. Sometimes it's often not easy to recognize something if it's very far outside of the normal expectations, if you like. If I tell you a very brief story, which is centuries old, but comes from a novel written in Chinese in the Ming Dynasty. There was a scholar who sat for the imperial examinations repeatedly and each time was rejected by the examiners for his essays, until one day an examiner read his essay. His first response to it, this is ridiculous, this is a terrible essay, and threw it away. But then something was nagging at the back of his mind, and he read it again and realized it was the most original commentary on the Confucian classics that he had ever read, and consequently passed the poor scholar first in his year. So this is obviously not a new question to me. Is the system set up in a way that maybe discourages that level of originality? Can we actually accommodate that kind of originality within the system, or do we create expectations that encourage people to be like everybody else in some way or other? Paul, what do you think about this question?
It's fascinating, and I'm going to be brief because I know that I've talked a lot. But when I was at Monash, I was part of the Faculty of Arts Research Committee that met to decide if non-traditional research was research, and that sounds really blunt and revolting, and it kind of was. I'll keep it very brief. Academic staff had to fill out a form, which was from the ARC for the era, about what their research was, the background to it, the research question, and how it was innovative. And research conveners from schools that had creative arts sat as a peer review panel on that. So translation studies, theatre, music performance, TV, media, film, journalism, and a few other things. And we decided as a panel about whether it met the ARC's definition of research and the university's definition of research. And if it was an impasse, it was sent to external review to another university. And there was pages and pages and pages of theory and whatever about whether that was research. Now that's very neoliberal environment. It's getting off topic of what a PhD, about non-traditional research, but it was helpful because it gave parity to everyone across the faculty, whether you got 1 point for it or whether you got 5 points for it, the book or a book or a journal article equivalent. So this was very clinical, and staff hated it initially, but it did work. It finessed out over a few years, but it really honed everyone's sensibility to non-traditional research. And rather than meetings taking 3 hours, they could get through in 15 minutes because it developed a culture of not thinking in these dichotomous ways so much. I haven't explained that very well, but I know the University of Sydney has a similar process. Probably other unis do as well, but that was the peer review process. And as I say, if there was an impasse or any doubts, it was sent to external peer review. But that was very, very rare. I mean, people who in practice-based research who are going into academia, I mean, this is probably the situation that you'll be put in. You can't just register your book or your 5-hour symphony. It won't get up as research unless you can convince a committee that it is research and not simply creative or a gimmick or whatever it is. And that can be hard. It is like putting a square peg in a round hole, or whatever the expression is. But if it's curated and managed sensibly and intelligently and collegially, it can work, even though it's sort of a bit weird that creativity is in a sense shoehorned like that. But that's we don't have a choice. That's how the landscape works.
I mean, would it be important, do you think, Paul, for it to be across the board at all universities so we all had the same sort of system? Because as it stands, we don't.
No, we don't. But I think practice research across the universities can be quite different. There are different nuances. For example, at Monash, for example, there would be certain research that wouldn't be counted as research, but I know at other institutions it would be. I'm not going to give an example because that might give away the game. This is not earth-shattering stuff, but I think there are differences and nuance. Certainly, the University of Sydney is similar to, but different from the Monash system. Probably Jenny Shaw might be able to talk a little bit about that, perhaps if that was in Jenny's time. But I know that there are subtle differences, but certainly one of the problems is duration. At Monash, a piece of music had to be 10 minutes to get 5 points or whatever it was. But we had someone who had a recording at 9 minutes 47 seconds.
And what would you do with Faburn?
Well, this is a moot point. Not a moot point, but this is where it doesn't work in a way where it's a little irrational. But these are the struggles with trying to compartmentalize and put parameters on creative practice.
I think when we're trying to compare quality and quantity, we're going to get into all kinds of problems here. And Sally has mentioned Webern, I think the obvious.
Yes, and there was someone at Monash wanted a 5 point to only be available to a large scale work like an opera or a symphony that had 14 instruments. Well, a piano solo of 5 minutes, that could be complex. So the issues around complexity and degree of labor are sort of false. They're not helpful. They're not helpful at all often. But I know that there are different views across the sector in music schools about complexity and
well, are we all on the same page when it comes to the idea that all research in the university we should have some way of saying we're on an equal playing field here? Or do we just simply recognize that the two kinds of outputs are different and we can't ever get to an equal playing field in music itself, probably, let alone across the arts, the creative arts?
A couple of interesting points have been made in the chat, I notice. Andrea has raised the question of 4 minutes 33 seconds. Is that a work to be measured by its duration or by its content and complexity? Since the Australian Review of Humanities published an entire issue late last year, which Sally and I both contributed to, it was proof that there's a great deal to say about 4 minutes 33 seconds. Whether anybody would have accepted the submission of that work as part of a composition portfolio in the 1950s, I think, is very dubious. I notice Charles has also pointed out that Webern's PhD was in musicology, and, which is, I think, a fair point and a relevant one. Lloyd, I was going to ask you about the question of originality as well. When it comes to music as composition or music as performance, how do you recognize originality and how do you measure it? Can you measure it?
Yeah, what a question. Wow. What a question. Yeah, again, this is idea from at least a teacher's perspective of, when you have a student who comes in and they challenge the status quo and convention, to what extent do you have to, hone them in or let them go upon their own way? I think if there's something just really unique and compelling, like a voice, either a compositional voice or a performative voice that is utterly unique and compelling, I think you have to let them go. And I don't know, I'm open to the idea of being challenged myself in new ways of approaching repertoire or teaching or performance. So I mean, I embrace wholeheartedly originality. It's a tricky question to answer. It's yeah. I haven't been very insightful here, I'm afraid.
Sometimes it is a question: is that a highly original performance of a work, or is that just a bad performance of a work?
it's it's subjective. That's a thing. That's a thing with music. It's so abstract that you know, it has various performances have different meaning to audiences, and that's the beauty of music. Something that I find to be disturbing might be immediately beautiful to someone else. So yeah, I think that's what I love about music. It's an entirely abstract nature, and I think that's why music is still relevant, because there's so very many ways that performers and composers can express themselves, and why indeed we have so many different sort of styles and forms of music, because we're a different person every day, and sometimes you feel like listening to Elvis, and some days you want to listen to Freddie Mercury, and the other days you want to listen to Monteverdi. So, I mean, putting all of those people in a room together, I could imagine would be a really interesting dinner party to be at in terms of originality.
April, I think that's a segue to you with the Freddie Mercury reference. Does your research give any insight into this question of originality, innovation, and so on, from the kind of framework that you are using?
I think it's a lot to do with, as Lloyd was saying, subjectivity. Like my research in particular, I actually insert myself in it because it's about how I'm entangled with what I'm researching. I can't step away and look from the outside because I'm the one that's doing the research. So I think originality is a hard one, but yeah, it's very much. I mean, I know in mine, my analysis chapters, they're all in first person and they're all in present tense, and you don't see that in most traditional theses. So originality is also something I worry about personally anyway, about whether, as you were saying, Stephen, whether it's original, whether it's just bad. So it's a tricky one, and it's subjective, and I think maybe the way forward is getting lots of different interpretations and maybe weighing it up through the different through all of those different interpretations. Maybe, I don't know.
Paul has raised a point, which is that University of Adelaide milestones require students to articulate and justify a statement of originality. Grayson, can I ask you? You've recently been through one of these milestones. What's your approach to justifying the originality of your research?
Yeah, well, that's a tricky one. Justifying the originality. I think with anything to do with, in my field, with Indigenous music, recreating stories in Indigenous cultural contexts and putting them at the center of a, you know, Western entity such as the orchestra is already creating a new sort of niche, number one. But number two, it's creating a new innovative market from which the original context of the stories came from. So in that context, the challenge is whether the material, whether the knowledge is inside those particular compositions are worthy for dissemination to Aboriginal community in the first place, in terms of my research. The second context, I think, is how far do I go in terms of the compositional components? Does it get too far away from the piece? Is it too original? So there's always a fine line of how much to rope in with what I'm doing in terms of my research outputs. At the very center of my practice-led research, it is always about generating some form of new knowledge in a new context, and it's always about my perspective as an Indigenous person, and fine-tuning the line between me as a composer, an Indigenous composer, and me as an Indigenous person, and walking along that line of originality, but still staying true to the original sentiment or knowledge.
Thanks, Grayson. It's now 5:45. I'm going to ask each of our panel members to make a final kind of statement or sum up their view of today's discussion and make any further comments that they'd like to make. And if there are a few minutes left at the end, also invite some members of the audience to make a statement as well. So Sally, would you like to begin by just giving your view of what we've been talking about, the issues that have come up and your perspective on this topic?
I think one of the things, the takeaways, I think for me, is that there needs to be a lot more work done to, I don't like the idea of standardizing research, actually. It's quite antithetical to the kind of work that I do, which is also using new materialist work and Deleuzian work. And I'm sort of also mindful in sort of thinking about that, what the function of each is, that you know, science is a kind of, in a broad term, as Deleuze has put it, it measures the world, philosophy thinks the world, and art senses the world. But of course, there's a whole, you know, these boundaries that we make around disciplines and about what they're doing are really deeply problematic. And I think that is definitely a takeaway from this session that we've had today, that we have actually made that really important point, that binary relationships and false dichotomies actually make things a lot more problematic. And yet we work in an institution that actually is requiring us to put hard boundaries around everything we do. And we've gone very dizzy almost with the idea that we have to account for every item that we produce, every research item that we produce, whether it be what we call a creative or practice-led research output versus, you know, and we're constantly putting them into those baskets, a traditional research output. And one of those outputs goes through a rigorous review process. The other hasn't even stood the test of time for 5 minutes, and it's in there, and claims have to be made about its originality and all sorts of things that really only time will probably tell, especially for musical composition. So I see this whole area is really fraught, and I've taken away some of the things that Paul has said, which is that, you know, at the institution he's working at, people are really thinking and debating seriously about this. I'd like to see this happen in universities across the whole country, so that we come up with something that's really kind of sensible and workable, and values, if you like, the different kinds of outputs that people are producing.
Thanks, Sally. Jennifer, would you like to give your view on what we've been talking about today and any takeaway that you have from it?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. The discussion has been really tremendous and really, really interesting. And I think has touched on some really important areas that we've all been struggling with over many years. And I think what for me is a takeaway is the way in which our disciplines are actually very adaptable and have increasing boundaries depending on changes in time and place and who's working in the field. And we've had discussion already about, for example, the Indigenous input into disciplines and the changes that has brought. But I absolutely agree with Sally that the boundaries that we impose on ourselves are deeply problematic. And this is one of the enlightening things about working with, say, new materialism or Deleuzian philosophies. It's all about breaking down those boundaries and allowing new questions to be asked, and looking for links and changes and, entanglements. And I think it's a really good way of sort of counteracting the way in which we've sort of tried to standardize everything within universities, where the opposite should be happening. We should be embracing originality and embracing the growth and development of disciplines. I am constantly reminded of a colleague of mine, Alan Atkinson, who was asked by a student, what do I need to do to get an HD? And Alan said, surprise me. And I think that's what we should all be asking ourselves. You know, what do I need to do to be doing well in my discipline? Surprise me. And it's the surprise that you see in originality and in the adaptability of the discipline and the pushing of the boundaries and the asking new questions. When that happens, you get the surprise. And that's what academic work should be about. That's what our discipline should be about, that constant push at the edges to get something new and original and exciting. That surprise element, I think, is so important. And I think this discussion has really highlighted some of those areas for me, and the importance of continuing to push at the edges of our discipline, and that search for surprise.
Yes, surprise. There's a famous line by Serge Diaghilev, the great ballet entrepreneur of the Ballet Russe, who, when asked what he expected from a production, he said, "Étonne-moi," astound me. So that's one step further than surprising. I think astounding would be even better. Thank you, Jennifer. April.
I think what I'm taking away from this is that maybe we need to talk more to other disciplines. I know my PhD is interdisciplinary and is just, I'm finding the whole talking about this, maybe if we, like Jennifer's insights are really interesting. I think maybe instead of just looking at it from a music perspective, practice-led versus research, maybe we need to go broader and maybe talk interdisciplinary wise about the whole thing, basically.
Sure. Thanks, April. Grayson, you have a takeaway from today's session?
Oh, I think the whole lot was just pretty enlightening and empowering, I think, because coming into any kind of research field, you have these set paradigms in your head about what research is, and then listening to the diversity and the different, spectrum of our interests and passion. I think that's been a really amazing takeaway for today. Just like to say thank you for having me on board today.
Thank you. Lloyd had to leave us a couple of minutes ago to go somewhere else. So, Paul.
I don't have too much to add. I really appreciated what Jennifer Clark has said, and also Grayson and others. I think I like Jennifer was trained as an historian where you kept yourself aloof, but our world has changed. And when Sally asked me to come on board to co-supervise April, I thought, oh, my goodness, what the hell is new materialism? What on earth do I have to offer? But actually, that's been a real turning point for me as a scholar. And also, I'm working on a project on Australian Indigenous history at the moment. And from what Grayson has said, and Jennifer, it's good to keep up to date with current affairs and to see how your postage stamp size of the discipline changes. Because now when I'm in historian mode and I put pen to paper, I now have to pause and question my own, I guess, subjectivity. And that should be part of what we all strive to do. I know that sounds very grand and a bit strange, but to keep learning from each other and to keep putting ourselves in our practice, whether it's astronomy or musical composition. I think we live in an age where we need to be more conscious of what we do and perhaps more proactive in our research than perhaps people like me who trained as an historian are used to. We're not used to that, but I think that's a takeaway. That's a bit garbled, but basically what Jennifer said and what Grayson said.
Thank you, Paul. Now we have about 5 minutes left, so I am now going to put some people in the audience on the spot. And you can decline to to say anything if you like, but I'm going to ask, first of all, Esmond Choi. Esmond, I see you there. You are one of our practice-led researchers and newly joined our higher degrees seminars. And I'd like to ask you what your takeaway from this discussion has been. Esmond, by the way, is a pianist with a great interest in contemporary music and modern music in general. Please, Esmond.
It's a lot of things, but I think the most important thing is kind of this research should be this kind of constant pushing, like on the cutting edge of things, and that kind of really that's what I'm trying to look at for my current project is, you know, this philosophy like Emerson and Thoreau, the Americans, that they were really constantly pushing for new ideas to form basically culture of the United States. And yeah, and it's good to hear that there can be very unconventional ways of researching, or even maybe not the standardized way to present the findings as well. So
great, thanks, Esmond. I'm going to put Eula Schuster on the spot now. What was your takeaway from today's discussion?
This has been very, very interesting. We must acknowledge that, I mean, music is such a broad church, so many styles and genres, and we have a huge amount of area to cover. So one size doesn't fit all, I don't think. But I think what we've brought to the fore is that we are thinking very much along the lines of opening up the boundaries, getting out to discover what other disciplines do, and maybe incorporating some of their methodologies and approaches and attitudes and values. And I think that's a very good thing to do. I put in the chat just a little comment about Elizabeth Wood's comments about creativity, which I thought were very enlightening, because Sally and I have written a lot about her research, and certainly her archival research that she did for her PhD in Adelaide University way back in the 70s was so innovative and so creative in the methodologies that she uses. They were new at the time, but she paid the price. You know, it was a very challenging time, and she didn't fit the musicology paradigm that we were brought up in, and so this was something that really her creativity, her originality made such a difference to the Australian music research, and she was the if you like, at the forefront, and we followed in her trail behind. So thank you for today. It's been terrific, and many more to come, I hope. Thank you.
Charles, I feel a comment from you is appropriate as well at this point. You have 2 minutes.
Not really, I don't. Other than to say I found it very stimulating and very worthwhile discussion, and I've been enjoying listening to everybody's views.
Good, thank you. Okay, thank you everyone. Thanks to Sally and Paul from the Musicology Hub for setting this whole process in motion. Thank you to our panel of experts on this topic, and thank you also to everyone who has attended today. I think I've also got a lot of things to think about, to take away from this, and hope to see you all at the next Music Matters seminar, which I think has not been scheduled.
No, Stephen, I was just wondering if people have any topics that are burning issues that they'd like to address. I mean, this is what the Music Matters seminar series is all about. And we want to make the topics that are, you know, make them sort of pertinent for you, for your work, for what you're doing, so that you can really get something out of them. So if you have any thoughts about what a topic could be, please let me or Paul or Eula know, you know, because we're running these from the Musicology Hub, needless to say. So there's another little compartment for you. But you know, if you've got any ideas, and or even to contact Stephen as well, would be great. And then we'll see what we can throw together for the next one.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, everyone. And it's time to finish. Thanks again, and good evening.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Sally.
Thanks, Sally.
Superbly chaired, Stephen. Well done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming, Kathy. Good to see you. Yeah. And see you again soon. Okay. Bye, everyone. Bye, Kathy.